Hello and welcome to this video for Chapter 5 of Basic Sentential Logic, Informal Fallacies, and Cognitive Biases. In this video I'll be talking about material corresponding to Section 5.4 of the text, and in particular the fallacy of straw man. Here's a definition of the fallacy. It's committed when the arguer distorts an opponent's position and then directs arguments at the distorted position and takes this to have defeated the actual argument. And you can see why it's called straw man instead of having a battle or a fight with the real opponent. Instead, you're attacking a fake, like a scarecrow or something like that. Something that's easy and can't really fight back. So it looks something like this. Smith says P and Q therefore are. Doesn't matter what Smith's argument is. What is important is that there is an argument and there's a conclusion that Smith's arguing for. Jones comes along and says, Smith has argued this way, and now Smith is going to tell us, or Jones is going to tell us what Smith's argument was. Jones says that Smith said P and K, therefore S. But that is a bad argument because of, and whatever. It doesn't matter what Jones says here. Jones is just arguing against this. Therefore, Smith is wrong. And the problem is that Jones's characterization of the argument is different from Smith's, and it's crucially different. And moreover, Jones's argument against Smith isn't directed at this. It's directed at this, at the mischaracterized version of the argument. For example, Ms. Smith has argued against prayer in public schools. Obviously, she advocates atheism, but atheism is what they have in Russia. Atheism leads to the suppression of all religions and the replacement of God by an omnipotent state. Is this what we want? Of course not. Ms. Smith's position is nonsense. Now, there's a lot of things going wrong in this argument. So there's some false premises here. Okay, Russia is not officially an atheist country. It commits a slippery slope fallacy, and that I haven't talked about yet. I think that might be the next video, or maybe 2 videos from now. But that's another problem. But there is a problem that I want to focus on, which is the mischaracterization of the argument. Okay, so that mischaracterization was that Smith actually said this, but the person who's saying this overall passage then immediately recharacterized it as this, which is different. Okay, you even if you're like super religious, you might think that there should be separation of church and state. You might argue against prayer in public schools. So these aren't the same thing. And it's the mischaracterization is what makes it a straw man fallacy. By the way, I gave this list of things that are going on here, and this points out something important that hasn't come up yet in these videos, which is that a lot of times pieces of reasoning can have more than one problem. And this argument here has a lot of problems going on. Right now we're just focusing on the straw man problem, but there's false premises, there's another issue going on, the slippery slope. But a lot of times arguments can have more than one problem. So don't think that there's only one fallacy an argument could possibly exhibit. Okay. So the mischaracterization is what makes it a straw man fallacy. It's important to note, though, that for the most part, the mischaracterizations are thematically related to the actual argument. Okay. So the actual argument was something against prayer in public schools. The mischaracterization was as an argument for atheism. Now, these are both, generally about religion. And in some sense, they're both kind of anti-religion, or they're against a position that some religious people might hold. Okay. And the reason is that if the mischaracterization wasn't thematically related somehow, strawman fallacy wouldn't work. Nobody would fall for it. Okay. So if, for instance, Ms. Smith has argued against prayer in public schools. Obviously, she advocates eliminating Social Security, right? Social Security is necessary for millions of retired Americans who've paid into the system their entire lives. Okay. No one would fall for this because the mischaracterization isn't related to prayer in public schools. So anybody reading this or listening to someone say this would immediately know that this person changed the argument and they wouldn't fall for it. Okay. But this version, if someone's just going quickly and people aren't stopping and thinking about it, and people often fail to stop and think, they may not realize that the topic has been changed. And this is why strawman works when it works. Okay? The topic of prayer in schools and atheism are related. So they're both generally about religion, but they're also positions that a strongly religious person might dislike. Okay. Next point. So first off, let me give you another example of this, what I'm talking about. The student committee has presented us with an argument favoring alcohol privileges on campus. So some universities have establishments where you can buy alcohol, others don't. And this would be part of a debate, let's say, on a campus that currently does not have any places where alcohol can be purchased, but the students want to add such a thing. Student committee has presented us with an argument favoring alcohol privileges on campus. What do the students want? Is it their intention to stay boozed up from the day they enter as freshmen to the day they graduate? Do they want a chain of bars across campus? Such a proposal is ridiculous. Probably the most common way to mischaracterize someone's position, to commit a strawman fallacy, is to make their conclusion much more extreme than it actually is. Because that simultaneously does two things. A position and an extreme version of that same position, they're similar. They're closely related. And so people may not notice that you've changed the topic if you just recharacterize it as a more extreme version of the original topic. And secondly, more extreme positions are easier to argue against. Okay? So, for instance, the original position is alcohol privileges on campus. That means something like, there's a location on campus where you can buy alcohol. UCSD has one or two places like that. But that gets mischaracterized as a chain of bars across the campus. Well, this is a lot easier to argue against. This just seems implausible. It seems like a bad idea. If someone was going to argue against either this or this would be the easier target. Okay? Here's a recent example. In an interview, Donald Trump said Joe Biden wants to defund the police. And this, in fact, is not Biden's position at all. And the person running the interview sort of pointed that out several times. Biden was in favor of some police reform, but explicitly refused to endorse defunding police. So this would be an example where someone was attributing a much stronger position to someone than was actually the case. Now, most of the examples that I've talked about so far, in fact, I think all of the examples, are where the person committing the straw man fallacy mischaracterized the conclusion, the final position that was being argued for. That's not always the case. Sometimes it's the conclusion they got right, but they're mischaracterizing the rest of the argument. Okay. So, for example, liberals are trying to make it possible for people to vote by mail because they know that mail-in ballots are easy to fake and they want to cheat the system. Now, this particular argument is getting the liberal position more or less right. So most liberals, the vast majority of liberals who want to make it easier for mail-in voting to occur, they're not. Their reasoning has nothing to do with election fraud or trying to fake ballots or anything like that. Their reasoning has to do with making sure that everybody who can legitimately vote can actually vote. Okay? And so this would be an example of still a straw man because the argument's being mischaracterized. Here, though, it's not the conclusion that's being mischaracterized, it's the premises, the nature of the reasoning. And again, this is something that has come up before and it's going to come up again. Bad reasoning does not reside on any part of the political spectrum. Well, actually, that's not entirely true. If you have a political spectrum, for the most part, bad reasoning is going to be much more common at the extremes, whether it's left or right, as opposed to the middle. Middle can still have bad reasoning, but the extremes are cases that attract and nurture bad reasoning in a certain kind of way. But here's an example. So if the top example might be a type of straw man fallacy that conservatives might push, here would be an example of a straw man fallacy that liberals might push. Conservatives want to cut corporate taxes because they don't care about normal people and just want the rich to get richer. Well, it is true that most conservatives, it's a standard conservative economic policy to not to cut or to lessen corporate taxes. The reasoning, though, isn't, oh, let's just let rich people get richer. The reasoning is that if corporations have a lighter tax burden, they can hire more people and it'll generally be good for the economy, which is good for everybody. That's the reasoning. So this would be a straw man fallacy. That gets the conclusion right, but mischaracterizes the argument for it. By the way, in both cases, and in all cases, we're not assessing whether the premises are true or false. Okay, so whether or not cutting corporate taxes really will help the economy, we're not assessing that. Whether or not making it easier for people to mail in ballots really will help, make a big difference in terms of people being able to vote. What percentage of people can't vote in person who would be able to vote by mail? Doesn't matter for our purposes. For our purposes, when we're assessing arguments, we just assume the premises are true and then assess whether it's a good argument or not. In this particular case, where straw man fallacies are in place, we're just looking at whether or not the premise that's being attributed to someone really was their premise or not. Okay, that's it for the straw man fallacy. Again, the key to understanding whether someone's committing straw man is that they are mischaracterizing someone else's position. Usually they're mischaracterizing the conclusion, and usually they're mischaracterizing it by making it more extreme than it actually is, because that's easier to argue against. But in some cases, it's not just more extreme. And in some cases, it's not even the conclusion that's being mischaracterized. Like in these two examples, it's the premise that's being mischaracterized. Oh, and by the way, one last remark on these. There might be some liberals who actually want to cheat the system, and there might be some conservatives who really don't care about normal people and just want rich to get richer. So I'm not saying that this would be a straw man against everybody's argument. But the vast majority of normal, everyday, liberal thinking people, why they would support this isn't because they want to cheat the system. And for the most normal middle-class conservatives who think that conservative economic policy is sound, this is not why. This is not a characterization of their reasoning process. Okay. Anyway, that's it for straw man fallacy. Keep studying, keep doing exercises, and good luck.